We operate under a central scientific assumption that observation is a passive act. We believe we can place a lens in front of a system, record its behavior, and walk away with the objective truth. But across multiple disciplines, the act of observation is a physically disruptive event. This side-by-side comparison illustrates a shared paradox between physics and biology. On the left, in the famous double-slit experiment, a subatomic system exists in a fluid wave of infinite probabilities until it is measured, forcing it to collapse into a single concrete physical state. On the right, we see the biological equivalent, raw, chaotic human affect, snapping into a regulated, predictable pattern the second an observer is introduced. Yet the field of affective computing is built on a contrary assumption. Engineers design sensors and algorithms under the premise that instruments operate as neutral windows into raw human emotion. That flattened post-observation state is captured and fed directly into machine learning models as objective truth. Subjecting a human being to measurement alters their biological state. This reaction creates an epistemological blind spot in modern effective science. We are recording the reaction to the sensor, not the internal reality of the subject. Quantum wave collapse mirrors human measurement. Fluid, unobserved states of potential are highly sensitive. The instant an observer appears, those states snap into concrete reality. Observation inevitably mutates the subject. Because of this, our instruments render us scientifically blind to genuine emotional architecture the exact moment we turn them on. To understand the error in our data, we have to define what natural emotion actually is. A natural emotion is spontaneous, is biologically grounded, and interoceptively driven. By definition, it emerges organically and occurs only when completely unobserved. When observation is introduced, that natural state vanishes. It is replaced by a highly adapted psychological output known as synthetic emotion. Synthetic emotions are socially constructed, rehearsed affective performances. They are not necessarily deceptive, but they are goal-oriented. They are triggered by the awareness of being watched, causing the individual to modulate their expression to fit perceived expectations. The scientific community routinely conflates these two distinct emotional constructs. Instruments designed to capture raw affect are deployed in highly structured, heavily monitored laboratory settings, guaranteeing that the subject is aware of their own surveillance. Therefore, modern emotional datasets do not measure authentic feeling. They measure human conformity to the act of observation. The baseline for how surveillance alters human behavior was documented nearly a century ago at the Hawthorne Works factory in Illinois. During a series of industrial experiments in the 1920s, researchers manipulated factory lighting to see if it affected worker output. Productivity improved when the lights were brightened. It also improved when the lights were dimmed. Productivity spiked simply because the workers knew management was watching. This became known as the Hawthorne effect. It proved that the mere presence of surveillance overrides an individual's natural behavioral baseline. To understand why this override is so powerful, we have to examine our evolutionary biology. To our ancestral subconscious, having multiple pairs of eyes locked onto you did not mean you were delivering a presentation. It meant you were being hunted. The brain translates the gaze of others into an immediate predator threat, activating the amygdala. This ancient threat detection circuit is the biological mechanism responsible for the experience of stage fright. Stage fright is a highly functioning, hyper-vigilant response orchestrated by the sympathetic nervous system. Adrenaline floods the bloodstream and heart rate spikes to prepare the body for physical danger. Under the scrutiny of the tribe, the brain executes a strict biological mandate: instantly mask any vulnerability to survive the social or physical threat. Any experimental setting that involves observation triggers this ancient self-preservation masking protocol. The laboratory is a stage, and the resulting biological data is a performance. We can see this threat response in the application of the polygraph. A subject is physically bound to a machine in a high-stakes environment and interrogated. The polygraph relies on the premise that internal conflict will reliably produce a unique physiological signature. But elevated heart rate and increased skin conductance are not exclusive to lying. They signal anticipatory anxiety, trauma-related memory, or intense self-monitoring. What the machine actually measures is emotional equivocation, the internal dissonance between a felt emotion and the performed emotion required to survive the scrutiny of the test. The same limitation applies to cortical measurement. Electroencephalography, or EEG, promises a window directly into the emotional brain. In reality, EEG primarily captures affective surfaces, shallow electrical patterns that reflect cognitive engagement, task compliance, and the rehearsed neural acts of an experimental subject following instructions. These shallow signals lack access to the deep, visceral interoceptive pathways originating in the body, which is where spontaneous, genuine, natural emotion originates. This chart visualizes the refined typology of emotion. Machine learning algorithms require ground truth, vast sets of baseline data used to teach an AI how to identify and interpret human emotion. When artificial intelligence networks ingest this contaminated biological stress data, they validate it as authentic ground truth. We feed the machine our defensive masking protocols, and the machine learns that this is what human emotion looks like. The consequence is a recursive feedback loop. We are programming autonomous systems to expect and effectively normalize performative emotional behavior. The psychological impact of the observer effect is dictated by the directional vector of the gaze. When a human being is the target of observation, looking inward while a laboratory or an audience looks at them, the ego contracts, the sympathetic nervous system engages, and hypervigilance takes over. But we can reverse this vector. We can observe what happens when the human is no longer the target, but the sole observer of a massive external macrosystem. Astronauts who leave the atmosphere and shift their gaze completely outward report a shift in cognition. This is the overview effect. Viewing the Earth as a fragile, floating biosphere triggers the immediate erasure of national boundaries and political conflicts. This cognitive inversion transitions the observer's identity from a citizen of a specific nation to a citizen of the planet. The self dissolves. Directing the gaze outward creates planetary metacognition. It shows that the mind's focus is dependent on its relationship to observation. The structural metaphor holds true across every scale. Just as observation collapses a quantum wave into a particle, the direction of human observation collapses our potential identity. Look inward under the gaze of others, and we contract into fear. Look outward at the totality of the system, and we expand into interconnectedness. This reveals the core flaw of current measurement paradigms. We attempt to extract emotional truth from an isolated body while ignoring the context of the room watching it. Until measurement tools account for the observer effect, recognizing how sensors alter biology, our affective models remain focused on the performance rather than the person. The observer and the observed are not separate entities. They are locked in a relationship that determines the outcome of the measurement.